Typical concatenation of famine, pestilence, and war. Famine struck first. By the early 14th century, agricultural product iron was barely enough to provide sustenance for the population, and the majority had just enough food to live. Famines had practically disappeared during the 13th century, but they returned again and again during the 14th. The first important famine hit France in 1302. Carpentier, Chapter 4122, and Le Mene 1996, 353. But the sustained population decline most likely began after the multi-annual famine of 1315 to 17. In fact, during 1315 to 30, a series of terrible winters brought famine in, an alarming warning sign of the troubles to come during the following century. Brodel 1988, 154-55. The second blow was delivered by the Black Death. The first wave of bubonic plague swept France in 1348 to 49. Between a quarter and a half, and in some cases 80 to 90%, of the population perished, depending on the region. Brodel 1988, 157. Recurrent plague epidemics were to hit France at intervals of roughly a decade during the rest of the century. For example, the second highest mortality peak in Lyon after 1348 to 49 was in 1361, Lawson 1974. The plague imposed a disproportionate mortality on the poor. For example, at Albi between 1343 and 1357, the proportion of the very poor, owning possessions estimated at less than 50 livres, fell from 76% to 62%. At the same time, the middle stratum, 50 to 200 livres, increased from 21% to 28.5%, and the proportion of the rich, over 200 livres, doubled from 4.2% to 8.1%. Dupaquier et al. 1988 ஆண்டு 32 மாதம் 33 நாள். Thus, one consequence of the plague was a distortion of the social pyramid, making it even more top-heavy than it was before the plague. We saw the same pattern in the English data. The effects of famine and disease, as well as war, on the population dynamics during the 14th century are well understood in a qualitative way, even if precise quantitative estimates are lacking. Dupaquier et al. 1988. The French population, like that in other Western European polities, began declining after 1300 CE, then experienced a precipitous drop in the wake of the Black Death epidemic of 1348, followed by further losses as epidemics recurred, as in 1361, and fighting in the 100 Years' War intensified. Overall population numbers declined by about one-half. Dupaquier et al. 1988b, 149, from 20 million to 10 million. After that, for about a century, population numbers fluctuated at a low level, starting to increase only during the second half of the 15th century. Although the crisis of the 14th century brought much misery, the population collapse had also some positive effects, at least for the lower strata. A relaxation of Malthusian pressure brought economic relief to peasants and workers. Apart from periods of particularly intense warfare, real wages and the consumption levels of ordinary people improved dramatically toward the end of the 14th century, table 4.3. In 1338, the Provence-Alpes drovers working on their lord's reserve ate a very crude kind of bread made mainly with barley. After the Black Death, barley bread was considered to be good enough only for the sheepdogs, while the labourers were entitled to wheat bread. Leroy Ladurie, 1987-70. MEDIVALFRANCE 123. Table 4.3 Daily Wages, ST, 1320 to 1500. Building worker year at Rouen infantryman. 13201.5, 1.01350, 3.52, 0.01380, 0.05.2, 1410, 3.8, 3.3, 1444.5, 2.71474.02, 0.71504.5, 3.4. Source: Bois, 1984, and Contamine, 1984. Lords and peasants. As we noted earlier, the beginning of the 14th century in France was characterized by elite overproduction. As the amount of surplus produced by peasants was shrinking, an example of the law of diminishing returns in action, the number of elites who were supported by the surplus was increased. Inge. To preserve caste, the lord was compelled to draw more on peasant production and by other means. On the other hand, any additional drain endangered the ability for self-subsistence of the peasant holding. The contradiction was insoluble and disruptive. Boas, 1984:260. The population decline of the years 1315 to 50 further exacerbated this basic contradiction. The post-1315 famines affected mainly the poorest strata of the society, and although many noblemen died in the plague, it had a disproportionate effect on the poor. As a result, the proportion of elites to the general population increased even beyond the already high levels of the early 14th century. As their incomes declined, the elites had to look to other means, in Guy-Bois's words, to preserve their caste. The end result was intensification of the intra-elite conflict for scarce resources. Particularly hard hit were the poorer nobles. Even in the 13th century, a great number of the lesser gentry in Forez lived on 25 livres viennois or less, Perroy 1962:28. As the food prices doubled or even tripled, as in the 1310s, these noble households slipped below the minimum level of consumption consistent with noble status. Indeed, some noble households must have starved during the famines of the early 14th century. By mid-century, there were literally tens of thousands of destitute and desperate noblemen of fighting age. Philippe Contamine, 1997:204, estimates that 25,000, if not 30,000 nobles flocked to the army of Philip VI in 1340 in the hope of military pay. There were 27,000 cavalrymen serving in the royal army in September. See HAPTER 4124. 1,340, Sumption 1991. It appears that the king and his lieutenants were surprised, even disconcerted by the huge numbers of men-at-arms responding to their call to arms. Contamine 1972-73. This disorganized and undisciplined crowd was one of the factors contributing to the subsequent French defeats at Crécy and Poitiers. The presence of huge numbers of men desperate and trained in the use of arms was a tremendous destabilizing factor. Elite overproduction was not limited to the military class. Between 1314 and 1343, the number of principal judicial officers of the various royal courts in Paris increased fourfold, the number of notaries by about the same, the sergeants who enforced compliance with the orders of the king's ministers and judges increased sevenfold. Sumption 1991-19. Estate collapse. At the same time that the intensity of intra-elite competition and conflict was rising, the state was gradually losing its ability to keep internal peace and protect the country from external invasion. The main problem was financial. Before the reign of Philip IV, 1270 to 1314, the crown had no difficulty living off its ordinary revenues, and occasionally collecting extraordinary levies, needed, for example, to ransom Louis IX when he was captured while on crusade in Egypt. By the end of the 13th century, however, the ordinary revenues had stagnated in real terms, while expenses, especially for military operations, soared. To raise revenues, Philip IV exploited his feudal rights, demanded subsidies, imposed forced loans on the bourgeois, and manipulated the currency. Henneman 1999, 105-6. These methods incurred much resentment, and the first half of the 14th century saw increasing resistance to taxation on behalf of various elites. The basic and essentially unresolvable problem was that the state competed with the elites for the shrinking surplus. Thus, we should modify the binary contradiction of Guy-Bois, that between lord and peasant, to a trinary contradiction of the productive class, the elites, the state. The lack of consensus on the need for national taxation had a direct effect on the ability of the state to wage war against the English. Philip VI, 1328-50, and John II, 1350-64, were unable to collect subsidies except in times of outright conflict, and were in a constant state of financial distress. Henneman 1999-110. As a result, France was always unprepared whenever military operations resumed after a truce. The military disasters of 1346 and 1347, the defeat at Crécy, the loss of Calais, finally persuaded the Estates General in 1355 to 1356 to authorize necessary taxation, but now their attempts to impose taxes ran into resistance at the local level. In the end, the estates were unable to produce the money they had promised MEDIEVA LFRANCE 125. Table 4.4 Dynamics of Assaults in the Officiality of Cerisy, Normandy. Number of percent involving period assaults per year, the use of weapons. 1314 to 1346, 0.12 to 1370 to 1414.49, 25, 450, 1,58, 4,340, 470, 1,480, 6, 0.78. Source: Finch, 1997. Henneman 1999:111. The collapse of royal finances was followed shortly by a general collapse of the French state, triggered by the defeat and capture of John III at Poitiers, 1356. The disintegrative phase of the Capetian cycle was dominated by a conflict known as the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was not simply a dynastic conflict between the French and English kings, but a period of great political instability, primarily within France. Salmon, 1976. As Brodel suggests, 1988-159, it would be more appropriate to call it 100 years of hostilities rather than a 100-year war, a period of recurrent state collapse and civil war. The conflict occurred at multiple levels. The highest level factions were led by the great seigneurs of France, the king himself, the Duke of Guienne, who also was the King of England, the Duke of Burgundy, and the Count of Flanders. From there, the level of conflict descended through the magnates, counts and barons, and various factions of nobility, down to knights and peasants. This multi-level nature of the conflict can be illustrated with the example of later medieval Gascony. Vale, 1986. At the national level, Gascony was one of the military frontiers in the Anglo-French struggle. At the regional level, the period from 1290 to the middle of the 15th century was dominated by the feud between the houses of Armagnac and Foix over the succession of the Viscounty of Béarn. At a more local level, private wars between lesser nobility proliferated in Gascony. Between 1290 and 1327, for example, at least 12 outbreaks of intra-elite violence are recorded in surviving sources. Vale, 1986, 140. And then there were numerous bands of routiers and écorcheurs who robbed and killed indiscriminately both lords and peers. Ants or ran protection rackets from castles, fortified churches, and manor houses. Wright, 1998. Interpersonal violence, crime, increased in parallel with organized violence. Statistics on violent crimes in at least one locality indicate there was a crime wave during the 14th century that peaked around 1400 and subsided by the second half of the 15th century. Table 4.4. CHAPTER 4126. The Dynamics of Sociopolitical Instability, 1290 to 1365. The sociopolitical crisis of the 14th century developed in France by degrees. The first signs of growing instability appeared in the frontier régions toward 1300. We have already discussed the collapse of order in Gascony from 1290 on. At the opposite end of the kingdom, in urbanized Flanders, social conflicts first broke out between 1279 and 1281, and later around the year 1300. The origin of the Troubles seems to have been tensions between the established urban patriciate and the newly enriched bourgeoisie, who used the proletariat as shock troops. Carpentier and Lemainet, 1996, 356. Eventually, the struggle for power led to a full-blown rebellion and the Battle of Courtrai, the Battle of the Spurs, in 1302, when Flemish infantry crushed aristocratic French cavalry. In 1325 to 26, the urban communities of Flanders rose against their ruler, Count Louis of Nevers. The burghers were massacred by the French army at the field of Cassel, 1328, and Flanders was temporarily pacified. However, in 1337, the Flemish revolted again, and under the leadership of Van Artevelde of Ghent, expelled Louis of Nevers, Perroy, 1965. The Flemish rebellion opened the northern route for the English invasion under Edward III. Meanwhile, other regions of France were also experiencing increasing instability. The north and east of France, Picardy, Burgundy, were sites of the baronial movement against royal taxation during the reign of Louis VI, 1314 to 16. In the county of Artois, the revolt against the central power became complicated by internecine fighting between the adherents of Robert of Artois and his aunt Mahaut, who both claimed the county, Hallam and Everard 2001, 392-93. Robert of Artois lost the struggle, and eventually ended up in exile in England, where he joined his voice to those urging Edward III to go to war against France. But the events in Brittany had a much more direct effect on the course of the 100 Years' War. In 1341, Duke John III of Brittany died without direct heirs. The succession was disputed between two factions, Blois and Montfort. In the ensuing civil war, the lesser nobles and the Celtic West supported the Montforts, while the great lords and the French-speaking bourgeois of the East rallied to the Blois faction. The English supported the Montfort faction by launching a chevauchée, a mounted raid whose purpose was to lay waste to the country, and besieging Rennes, Vannes, and Nantes. Seward, 1978-49. Another faction arose in the 1350s. It was led by Charles the Bad, the King of Navarre, who was son of Joan of France, and therefore a grandson of Louis VIII, giving him a reasonable claim on the French throne, and Philip of Evreux. This faction was sometimes referred to as the Evreux faction, and sometimes as the Navarrese. Charles the Bad inherited substantial Medie VLFRANCE 127 landholdings in Normandy and Ile-de-France, and he provided leadership to the dissident nobilities of these regions. Charles the Bad was a disruptive influence from 1354, when he murdered the French constable, the chief military officer, to 1364, when the rising of his faction in Normandy and Ile-de-France was suppressed by Charles V. These examples of internecine fighting, to which we should add the later factional conflict between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, illustrate the thesis, generally supported by modern historians, that the 100 Years' War was primarily an internal conflict. The international aspect of the war arose primarily, if not solely, because various rival factions appealed to the kings of England or France. Thus, the Montfort and Artevelde factions invited Edward III to intervene in Brittany and Flanders, respectively. It was supposedly Jan van Artevelde who suggested that Edward III should declare himself the King of France in order to legitimize the Flemish support. Another example of the same trend is the resumption of war in 1369, which resulted from the appeal to Charles V by the Count of Armagnac against the Black Prince. Finally, the darkest period of the war for the French, 1420-36, came about as a result of the alliance of the Burgundians and the English. Intralite conflicts brought a host of other rebellions and uprisings in their wake, of which we will mention only two, the Paris Rebellion and the Jacquerie. In 1357, the Dauphin, future Charles V, who was the head of state as a result of his father's capture at Poitiers, lost Paris to a coalition of urban elites led by the wealthy cloth dealer Etienne Marcel. During the revolt, the Paris mob murdered 2 royal marshals in front of the Dauphin. Incidentally, the Marcel faction in Paris was allied with another troublemaker, Charles the Bad of Navarre. During the winter of 1357-58, the gangs of Anglo-Navarrais were day by day conquering and laying waste the entire region between the Loire and Seine. Froissart, cited in Fourquin, 1978, 136. The pillaging by men-at-arms, on top of the fiscal demands of the monarchy and the seigneurial reaction, pushed the peasants of Ile-de-France beyond the breaking point. The Jacquerie started in May 1358 and was suppressed by the nobles in June, Fourquin, 1978, 134-136. The years 1356-60 were the nadir. Shocked by the state collapse, the nobility started to consolidate around the Dauphin and achieved a general consensus on fiscal reform, Henneman 1999-112. The immediate stimulus for imposing taxes was the need to pay the huge ransom for John II, who had been captured at Poitiers. However, the ordinance of the 5th of December 1360 became a landmark in French fiscal history, Henneman 1999-113, establishing the basic framework of the Ancien Regime. It imposed the salt tax, gabelle, and indirect sales taxes on other types of consumption, aids. The Estates General agreed to another important new tax known as the CHAPTER 4128. Fouage, the hearth tax. Direct taxes, such as the fouage, later renamed taille, became a long tradition in French royal taxation. Whereas indirect taxes primarily affected the urban population, Direct taxes such as the feuillage also bore on rural lordships. It was not popular with the nobility, but they did not raise much opposition because the primary purpose of this tax was to pay military salaries. In fact, it may appear surprising how little opposition there was to new taxes. The need to ransom the king was clearly one factor. In the end, the whole amount of ransom was never paid. Instead, the government of Charles V wisely used the money to build a new army. Perhaps even more important was the collective realization that something had to be done or France would be lost. Another contributing factor was the massive pruning of the French nobility administered by the war. The worst disaster, that of Crécy, wiped out 10,000 of the flower of the French nobility, and Poitiers accounted for another 2,500. Some thousands died at the naval battle of Sluys, 1340, and unknown thousands died in the local civil wars and at the hands of the Jacques of Ile-de-France. In short, by 1360 there were simply many fewer noble thugs to raise trouble. Some had been killed off, others had inherited the property of their slain relatives. The swing in public opinion in favor of peace is evident in the new tone of the literature on warfare and chivalry. Whereas earlier the emphasis had been on the right to private war and the pursuit of honor and glory, now it addressed questions of discipline and public order. Henneman, 1996, 142. We should not, however, overestimate the strength of this consensus. It lasted for 2 decades, the 1360s and 1370s. When the new generation, which did not directly experience the collapse of 1356-60, came to power, it allowed things to fall apart again. When Charles V became king in 1365, the national consolidation, even if temporary, resulted in a rapid recovery of the territory lost to the English. Unlike the huge and undisciplined throngs of the previous reign, the army of Charles V consisted of only 2,400 men-at-arms and 1,000 crossbowmen, of which 60% were mounted. Contamine, 1972, 138. These troops were permanently employed and regularly paid. The permanent forces were joined during periods of particularly intense activity by supplementary retinues of men-at-arms, bringing the total to the maximum of 5,200. The first military success of the new army was in crushing the forces of the Auxi-Vreux faction in Normandy, led by Charles the Bad, in the spring of 1364. Henneman, 1999, 115. In 1369, the war with the English resumed as a result of the appeal by the Count of Armagnac, and before the death of Charles V in 1380, almost all French territory was regained. The English held only Bordeaux, Bayonne, Brest, Calais, Cherbourg, and Valais, and their immediately surrounding territory. Medievalfrance 129. Figure 4.5 Population dynamics in Normandy, 1250 to 1560, after Bois 1984. 4.5 Depression, 1365 to 1450. Population stagnation. After the disasters of the mid-14th century that reduced its populate tie-in by a third and half, France entered a period of seeming stagnation until 1450. Stagnation, however, does not mean steady state. Rather, this period was characterized by short periods of recovery followed by new collapses. The process can be illustrated with data from Normandy, Bois 1984-76. There were 3 periods of crisis, with population minima in 1380, 1420 and 1450, interspersed with 2 periods of partial recovery, and then by a sustained population growth after 1450, figure 4.5. The incidence of population decline is closely correlated with the intensification of internal war, not only because of war's direct effect on demographic rates, but also because of its indirect consequences for the product's tithe infrastructure. Similar dynamics of partial recovery, followed by crashes, were characteristic of other regions, although the timing of the fluctuations varied in accordance with regional variations in the fluxes of internal warfare and recurrent epidemics. Carpentier and Lemaine, 1996:378-80, provide an overview of fluctuations in Hainaut, Artois, Provence, and Dauphiné. Altogether, they propose that the French population decreased between 1350, that is, after the first shock of the Black Death, and 1450, the lowest point, by a third. When this decline is added to the demographic catastrophe of the mid-14th century, discussed in the previous section, the overall change between 1300 and 1450 is estimated to be around 1/2, Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, Dupaquier et al. 1988, some regions experienced declines that were even more catastrophic, such as the 70% fall in Normandy, Bois 1984. Furthermore, a reanalysis of some data suggests that earlier historians were sometimes too conservative, Chapter 4, 130, in estimating the degree of population crash. For example, in a widely cited estimate, Fourcoing, 1964, calculated that the region of Paris lost 1/2 its population. However, a later reanalysis of the same data by Bois, Indy, catered a fall of 75%, Bois 2000. The effect of persistent warfare. The socio-political instability of the 100 Years' War had an enormous impact on the productive capacity of French society, Braudel, 1988, 160 to 161. Some areas were fought over repeatedly and suffered most. We have already quoted in Chapter 1 from the Chronicle of Thomas Bazin describing the devastation of Normandy. By 1450, the population of Normandy had fallen to 30% of its peak in the early 14th century, figure 4.5. The Paris region was another area where fighting was prolonged, and its rural population may have decreased fourfold. The region suffered both because it was close to Flanders and Normandy, the sources of the English chevauchée, and because it was the national capital. Here is Petrarch on his visit to France in 1360. I could scarcely recognize anything I saw. The most opulent of kingdoms is a heap of ashes. There was not a single house standing, except those protected by the ramparts of towns and citadels. Where is now Paris, that was once such a great city? Quoted by Braudel, 1988:161. 2 generations later, Paris was the battleground between Armagnacs and Burgundians, who vied with each other to prove how far bloodthirstiness could go. Murders and massacres never ceased. When the Burgundians entered the capital in May 1418, it was littered with Armagnac corpses, piled up like pigs in the mud. Braudel, 1988. 160, the quote is from a contemporary journal d'un bourgeois de Paris. The south, especially southwest, was similarly devastated. Philippe de la Boissière wrote in the 15th century that this land of Saintonge, except for the towns and fortresses, was deserted and uninhabited. Where there had once been fine manors, domains, and heritages, towering bushes grew. Braudel, 1988, 160. Some areas escaped devastation for a while. When the English under the Black Prince marched through the Massif Central in 1356, they found the land of Auvergne, which they had never before entered, so prosperous and so full of all manner of goods that it was a marvel to see. Froissart, quoted in Braudel, 1988, 160. Need. Less to say, the prosperity of Auvergne did not survive the Black Prince and his troops. Famine became endemic in France in the first half of the 15th century. There were crises in food supplies around Paris and Rouen in 1421, 1432, 1433, and particularly 1437-39. But these crises were not a fundamental cause of population stagnation. Rather, they were an aggravating MEDIEVALFRANCE 131. Circumstance. The underlying cause was the war, Leroy-Ladurie, 1987:35. This can be seen most graphically in the dynamics of the real wage, Allen, 2001. The 14th century population decline translated into excellent real wages for working people. Thus, in the first decade of the 15th century, a building labourer in Paris could buy more than 20 kilograms of grain with his daily wage. Similarly, high wages prevailed for several decades after the end of the 100 Years' War. During the war, decades of the 1420s and 1430s, by contrast, the labourer's wage collapsed to less than 8 kilograms of grain per day. The problem was not lack of cultivable land or people to cultivate it. The fundamental problem was lack of security. Peasants abandoned villages for the relative safety of fortified towns. For example, around such Alsatian towns as Colmar, there were whole belts of dead villages. The land that was abandoned was allowed to turn fallow, or was lightly utilized for grazing cattle. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987:37. Incessant warfare also destroyed infrastructure. For example, in the area of Langley, modern Pas-de-Calais, the drainage system was abandoned, and the land was first flooded and then deserted. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987-38. The degree of village abandonment, similar to German Wüstenungen, varied with region in France. The south was more strongly affected, with between 25 and 33% of villages abandoned in Provence. Many of these desertions were final, affecting 1/4 of localities in mountainous regions. In the north, by contrast, only 3 to 10% of villages were abandoned forever. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987:38. Altogether, Leroy-Ladurie, 1974:42, estimates that a minimum of 3 to 4 million hectares of land was abandoned between 1350 and 1440. Elite dynamics. Incessant fighting affected aristocracy to an even greater degree than the commoner population. Enormous numbers of French nobles were dispossessed during this period, right 1998. The population collapse of the second half of the 14th century and the ensuing depression resulted in a divergent evolution of the economic well-being of nobility and peasants. Ants, Carpentier and Lemeny, 1996:463. After some lag time, declining population pushed down grain prices and drove up real wages. Small people were the beneficiaries of the new economic conjuncture. It would be an exaggeration to call this period the golden age of peasants, because they continuously suffered from incessant warfare, periodic epidemics, and recurrent famines, themselves largely caused by warfare. Nevertheless, they usually had enough food to feed the family. And even during bad times, for example, between 1420 and 1440 in Paris, their wages were substantially above those during the peaceful period of 1520 to 60, when population densities again approached the ceiling of the carrying capacity. CHAPTER 4132. The economic well-being of the nobility moved opposite to that of the peasants. They profited little from cheaper grain because many grew food on their own estates, and in any case food did not loom as large in their consumption budget as it did for commoners. Because wages increased, nobles had to pay more for manufactures and services necessary for signaling their elite status. The alternative was a quiet slide into the ranks of commoners. In other words, nobles had to spend more just to maintain the level of living they had previously become accustomed to. Unfortunately, noble incomes declined at the same time as their expenditures increased. Even before 1350, a good half of nobility enjoyed incomes of only 40 livres or less than a well-to-do farmer, who had an income of about 60 livres. Carpentier and Lemeny, 1996:464. After his review of what is known about the noble incomes during the period between 1280 and 1340, Contamine, 1997:107, concluded that the great majority of noble incomes were modest or even mediocre, and that it was quite problematic for them even to maintain their means of existence. The severe recession of the 14th century, coupled with the civil wars and peasant uprisings, resulted in nothing short of catastrophe. All sources of noble income declined: rents, revenues from justice, profits from seigneurial equipment such as mills and baking ovens, and tolls from fairs and markets. Carpentier and Lemeny, 1996:465. Bois, 2000:115. Most seigneurs lost 1/2 to 3/4 of their revenues between 1350 and 1450. Bois, 2115. Thus, in just 30 years, 1335 to 64, the income of Jeanne de Navarre from her Champagne and Brie properties fell by 58%, from 23,000 to 10,000 livres. Between 1340 and 1400, the income of the Abbey of Saint-Denis fell by 50% in nominal terms and by 2/3 in real terms, from 72,000 to 24,000 setiers of grain. The buying power in cereals of the seigneurial income of Jeanne de Chalon in 1420 was only 15 to 20% of that enjoyed by her grandparents in the 1340s. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987:61 to 64. The Dame de Chalon at least managed to survive modestly and pass on to her heirs some vestiges of her patrimony. Other less fortunate noble families disappeared as such, slaughtered in battle, succumbed to the plague, or ruined and plunged into the lower classes. In 1378, the average income of a knight in the châtellenie of Mello, in the bailliage of Senlis, the Paris region, was only 45 livres parisis, while squires had to do with only 25 livres parisis. Biguenet, cited in Contamine, 1997-89. The peaceful period of 1380 to 1410 saw some restoration of noble incomes. But with the resumption of civil war and English invasions, the revenues plunged to new lows. For example, the income of the Castellanes of Laines and Grisel in the county of Tonnerre fell from 500 to 238 LP between 1405 and 1425. In 1343, before the Troubles, the Prévôt of Tonnerre reported an annual revenue of 520 livres. The revenue then fell to 182 livres in 1405 and 114 livres. MEDIEVALFRA NCE 133 in 1425, Contamine 1997, 110. The data from Normandy indicate income declined nearly 50% between 1400 and 1450, Contamine 1997, 111 to 115. 12. An example of a more extreme collapse is provided by the Seigneury of Sully in the Orléans region, whose revenue fell from 700 livres, parisis in 1383 to 13 livres, parisis in 1455, Contamine 1997 இலவசம் 11.13. The severe depression of landed incomes did not affect all noble families uniformly. Rather, it imposed a selection regime in which the weak and unlucky declined and eventually succumbed, while the strong and lucky held their own, or even got ahead. The impoverished nobles who attempted to maintain the levels of consumption necessary for preserving their status rapidly ran up debt and eventually had to sell their lands. Thus, the majority of the plebe nobiliare, those families that already were on the brink by 1350, were plunged beyond the point of no return. On the other hand, many magnate families during this period were buying up lands. It was easier for a grand seigneur to reduce consumption without crossing the line between nobility and commonalty. Furthermore, magnates were better positioned to profit from the royal patronage, even though the volume of the flow of royal favours was greatly diminished during this era. And land was cheap. Another group that profited from the economic situation consisted of certain bourgeois, particularly those who provided administrators and legists for the state. Essentially, these office holders were the forerunners of the robe nobility that merged into the ruling class during the subsequent centuries. On the other hand, merchants apparently did not do particularly well, unless they had first become office holders. At least this appears to be true for the Paris region. Fourquin, 1964. What were the consequences of these economic difficulties for noble numbers and replacement rates? There are a few regional studies that yield quantitative data documenting elite dynamics in medieval France. Lawson's 1981 study of wills registered in the Officialty of Lyon yielded some information on the number of living children at the time of death of a testator, Table 4.5. These numbers incidentally give us information about the relative dynamics of the replacement rate. In order to calculate the absolute replacement rate, we would have to multiply it by the proportion of males among the children and also take into account the proportion of families that did not have any children. However, for our purposes, relative changes is what we need. The data indicate that family sizes of both noble and non-noble families declined during the 14th century, then increased during the 15th century. The difference between the noble and non-noble families is instructive. During the 14th century, noble households tended to have substantially more children than non-noble families. But with time this differential declined, and even inverted its sign by the end of the 15th century. However, the noble advantage of greater family size was sub CHA PTER 4134. Table 4.5, number of living children per testator having children. Period nobles, non-nobles differential. 1300 to 1344.33.2 plus 1.1 1340 to 1383.4 2.6 plus 1.2 1380 to 1423.8 2.8 plus 1.0142 to 146 04.23.5 plus 0.71460 -1500 minus 1.6. Source: Lawson, 1981, cited in Contamine, 1997-59. Substantially reduced, if not nullified, by the tendency of a high proportion of noble daughters to become nuns. 2/3 of noble women in Lyon entered a nunnery during the first half of the 14th century, but only 14% did so during the last half of the 15th century. Table 4.6. These proportions should be compared to just 2.4% of non-nobles choosing a religious career during the whole period. It is clear that noble families shipped to religious houses their surplus female progeny, since the proportion of daughters becoming nuns increased from 15% for small families, 3 children or less, to 45% for the largest families, 7 children or more. Also, a very substantial proportion of males chose a religious career. The final interesting datum yielded by the study of Lawson is the disparity between sex ratios of noble and non-noble families. In commoner families, the ratio of males to females was 113 to 100, just as we would expect in a pre-industrial society where a substantial proportion of women died in childbirth. The sex ratio of noble families was an astonishing 85 males per 100 females. In other words, there were 1/4 fewer noble males than expected. Partly, this pattern must be due to a high proportion of women entering nunneries, and thus being spared the dangers of childbirth. But most of the difference is probably due to the hecatombs of the English and Civil Wars. Taken together, falling family sizes, a high proportion of noblemen and noblewomen choosing a religious career, and a huge male deficit. These data suggest that the nobility of the Lion region was under a substantial degree of pressure, to the point where this period can be appropriately characterized by a crisis of nobility. The pressure gradually relaxed during the 15th century. However, even by 1500, the replacement rates of noble households continued to lag that of commoners. Some less detailed data from other regions appear to support the picture painted by the study of Lawson. For example, the Breton family of Tournemine de la Hunaudaye produced an average of 4 children per marriage in the 13th century, 2.75 in the 14th, and 3.25 in the 15th, Contamine 1997-60. Urban elites were affected in a similar way. MEDIEVALFRA NCE 135. Table 4.6. Proportion of children in noble families becoming priests or monks, nuns. Period sons %, daughters %. 1300 to 1350 45 60 1350 to 1400 20 40 1400 to 1450 29 1450 to 1500 16 14. Source: Lorcan, 1981, cited in Contamine, 1997, 246. As the data from Périgueux indicate, high family sizes in the second half of the 13th century, a decline to a minimum in the 15th century, and then an increase to 1500, see Table 4.1. Economic difficulties, elevated mortality due to conflicts, and low replacement rates had a measurable effect on the rate of noble family and lineage extinction. Although the county of Forez, in south-central France, escaped the worst excesses of the 100 Years' War, the rate of extinction of noble lineages in this region increased almost twofold, from 31% during the 13th century to 54% in the 14th century and 55% in the 15th century. Perroy, 1962-31. In the region of Bar-sur-Seine, the family extinction rate during the 13th century was 58%, 35 out of 60, but this figure increased to 75%, 15 out of 20, during the following century, Contamine 1997-63. It should be noted that the Forez and Bar-sur-Seine data cannot be directly compared, because the former relate to lineages potentially comprising several families, and the latter refer to individual families. Thus, the rate of lineage extinction is expected to be less than that of families. In the Vesubie Valley, a third of all families faded away during the first quarter of the 15th century, implying an extinction rate of 80% per century. This was a much higher rate than during the 14th century, when the extinction rate was already a rather high 67%. Contamine, 1997:63. The dynamics of socio-political instability, 1365 to 1450. France experienced a full-blown state collapse during 1356 to 60, followed by a period of temporary consolidation during which most of the territory was reconquered from the English. The consensus, however, proved to be temporary and began unravelling after the death of Charles V. The next reign, that of Charles VI, 1380 to 1422, was to see the second state collapse of the 100 Years' War. At the beginning of his reign, Charles VI was a minor, and the government was dominated by his uncles, the Dukes of Cha, Peter 4, 136. Anjou, Berry, and Burgundy, also known as the Princes of the Lilies. The state policy was disrupted by factionalism. Some taxes were permanently annulled, such as the fouage. Others were first annulled, then reimposed, such as the aides and gabelles, although brief rebellions against them had to be crushed. The erosion of royal taxing power was accompanied by an erosion of royal revenues brought about by the diversion of large sums by the Princes of the Lilies, who pocketed virtually all taxes collected by the crown in their appanages. Henneman, 1999. The social and political situation began to develop in a manner very similar to that of the 1340 and 1350. Again, there were great crowds of impoverished nobles looking for military employment. Thus, in the fall of 1386, between 10,000 and 20,000 nobles flocked to Les Clous, where preparations to invade England were underway. The invasion never took place. Contamine, 1997, 205. Elite factionalism gradually developed into an extremely bitter and sanguinary civil war. One of the main factions coalesced around Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, who was the uncle of Charles VI. The opposing faction was led by the Marmousets, a group that included the civil officials and military leaders close to the previous king, Charles V, Henneman, 1996. The political program of the Duke of Burgundy was to use the resources of France to build an independent principality in Burgundy and the Low Countries. The Marmousets' objectives were to relieve the burden on the taxpayers while building up the resources in the royal coffers. Henneman, 1996, 141-42. The Marmousets were also supportive of the Italian project of another royal uncle, Louis of Anjou, and his son Louis II, who had dynastic ambitions on the throne of Naples. Another important leader was the king's brother, Louis of Orleans, who gradually took over the Marmousset faction. As noble factionism grew, the central government was greatly weakened by the intermittent insanity of the king. To cut the long and confusing story short, eventually the French political scene became dominated by two great factions, one led by the Dukes of Burgundy, the Burgundians, and the other first by Louis of Orleans, the Orleanists, and then by the Count of Armagnac, father-in-law of Charles, the new Duke of Orleans, after his father was assassinated in 1407, the Armagnacs. After the assassination of Louis of Orleans, which was carried out under orders of John the Fearless of Burgundy, the son of Philip the Bold, France divided into two armed camps, Seward, 1978-148. The Burgundians drew their strength from John's territories in the northeast and north, and from the Parisian bourgeoisie and academics. The Armagnacs were the party of the greater royal officials and high nobility, with a large following in the south and southwest. During 1407-14, the two factions battled for the capital, and both at different times appealed to the English for aid. By 1414, the Armagnacs had gained control of most of France, including the Medievalfrance 137. Capital, Seward, 1978:155, but John of Burgundy allied himself with the new English king, Henry V. In 1415, Henry V invaded France and won the great victory at Agincourt. The loss of 10,000 French knights was a terrible blow to the Armagnacs, because it reversed the balance of forces decisively in favour of the Burgundians. As the new constable, the Count of Armagnac, was besieged in Paris by the Burgundian forces, the English conquest of Normandy proceeded completely unopposed. Seward, 1978, 172. In 1418, the Burgundian supporters rose up in Paris and killed thousands of Armagnacs. This was the occasion of the quotation from the bourgeois of Paris about the Armagnacs lying in the streets like slaughtered pigs. The Dauphin, the future Charles VII, and the Armagnacs abandoned Paris to the Burgundians. In 1419, Rouen surrendered to Henry V, and the English conquest of Normandy was complete. The English advance horrified John the Fearless, and he attempted to negotiate with the Dauphin and the Armagnacs. But the Armagnacs revenged themselves on John of Burgundy by assassinating him at a conference with the Dauphin at the bridge of Montereau. The new Duke, Philip the Good, vowed vengeance and returned to the English alliance. Working with the Burgundians, the English overran northern France and installed themselves in Paris. By the Treaty of Troyes, Henry V married the daughter of Charles VI and was named the heir to the French throne, while the Dauphin, future Charles VII, was disinherited. In 1422, both Charles VI and Henry V died. The infant Henry VI of England was recognised as King of France in the north, supported by the Burgundians, and crowned in Paris, 1436. The position of the Dauphinistes, formerly Armagnacs, continued to deteriorate during the 1420s. In 1424 they lost the Battle of Verneuil, and in 1428 the English began the siege of Orleans. Meanwhile, Lancastrian France had become a wilderness laid waste by its garrisons, by Dauphinist raiders, by deserters, and by écorcheurs. The écorcheurs, or flayers, were the heirs of the routiers of the previous century. They took their name from the custom of stripping their victims to the skin, or even flaying them alive. Seward, 1978, 194. It was during this period that the populations of Ile-de-France, Normandy, and doubtlessly many other regions declined to 25 to 30% of their 1300 peak. The disintegrative trend reverses itself. The years 1428 to 29 were the nadir of the second French state collapse of the 100 Years' War. The turning point came when Jeanne d'Arc lifted the siege of Orleans, followed by the coronation of Charles VII in Reims, 1429. The conclusion of a treaty with the Duke of Burgundy, 1435, brought the Civil War to an end, and the French reconquest slowly gathered, Chapter 4138. Steam, Paris was recovered in 1436, Gascony, except Bordeaux and Bayonne, was reconquered in 1442, Normandy in 1450, and finally Bordeaux fell on 1453. The decade after 1435 saw a permanent establishment of state finance in France. Henneman, 1999, 117. Indirect taxes, aides, were restored in 1435, Languedoc, and 1437, Languedoc. In 1439, the estates of Languedoc granted direct taxes, taille, for 1 year to support regularly paid troops. The restoration of fiscal and political order was briefly interrupted by a revolt of princes in 1440, the Praguerie. But the crown continued collecting the taille without consulting the estates. In 1445, Charles VII established a regular cavalry, compagnies d'ordonnance. By 1460, the restored fiscal system was producing 1.8 million OLT a year, most of it coming from direct taxes, with only 50,000 OLT from the royal domain. Henneman, 1999, 118. Thus, the basic fiscal system, first introduced in the 1360s, was finally implemented in the 1440s. A solid fiscal foundation was a factor of critical importance in ending the 100 Years' War, but it itself was a consequence of the newfound feeling of national unity among the elites. What was the basis of this new unity, and how did it replace the divisive atmosphere of the early 15th century? Two factors were at work. The first one was a shift in the social psychology. Everybody was tired of incessant internal and external warfare. Around 1400, the yearning for peace was increasingly voiced. Veniat pax, let there be peace, was the cry of an early 14th century sermon by Jean Gerson, Tuchman, 1978, 537. Furthermore, although the conflict started as a civil war, it gradually transmuted into a national war of liberation against the English, Henneman, 1996. The second factor was that the nobility was numerically decimated, which removed the social pressure for elite factionalization that had fueled the civil conflict. The hecatombs inflicted on the French nobility during the second stage of the 100 Years' War were comparable in magnitude to, if not greater, proportionately speaking, than those of the first. The worst was undoubtedly Agincourt, 1415, where 10,000 French nobles died, Contamine, 1984. Among the fallen were more than 10 dukes and counts, 120 barons, and 1,500 knights, Seward, 1978:169. Earlier, many thousands of French nobles had participated in the crusade to free Hungary from the Turks, where they perished in the Battle of Nicopolis, 1396. The Dauphinist casualties at the Battle of Verneuil, 1424, were about 7,000, though many of them were Scots, but casualties in the large battles were probably only a minor part of the total drain on the French nobility. Untold thousands lost their lives in the civil wars and small-scale military operations, sieges, skirmishes, against the English. We have already referred to the massacre of Armagnacs in Paris, 1418. King Henry V of England, as well as other military leaders of the time, was notorious for the atrocities he routinely committed. Best known is the killing of the prisoners he Medievalfra NCE 139 ordered on the field of Agincourt, but there were many others. For example, when he took the Armagnac castle of Rougemont, 1421, he hanged the entire garrison. Those defenders who escaped and were later caught were drowned. Seward 1978:186. When dispossessed nobles in Normandy persisted in fighting a guerrilla warfare, the English called them brigands and hanged them when they caught them. Seward 1978:178. Other atrocities include the butchering of 2,000 men, women, and children in Caen, 1417, and Henry's refusal to allow 12,000 poor folk driven out of the besieged and starving Rouen to leave. He forced them to stay in a ditch where most of them died of inclement climate, it was winter, and starvation. Seward, 1978. The last two examples refer to commoners, but they illustrate how callous the fighting men were about taking life, and the nobility were often treated in the same way as commoners, except when there was the hope of a ransom. The result of this casual attitude to taking life was a population decline in general, but more specifically the decimation of nobility. Because the proportion of nobility among the general population declined between 1300 and 1450, the numbers of nobility decreased even more than the general population. The crisis phases of secular cycles are typically characterized by increased social mobility, both upward and downward. The main factor driving the turnover of the social hierarchy is the growing economic inequality during the stagflation and crisis phases. As the conditions of overpopulation develop and large numbers of peasants are impoverished, some favored few nevertheless become richer. These families desire to translate their improved economic conditions into social status. Similarly, under the conditions of elite overproduction, the majority of aristocrats lose ground and are faced with the prospect of downward mobility, but a few accumulate property and wish to move up into the magnate stratum. The pent-up demand for upward social mobility from elite and magnate aspirants during the crisis phase provides a cheap alternative for cash-strapped rulers to recompense their supporters. As a result, this is when we typically see evidence of upward social mobility. In medieval France, we can quantify this process by observing how the numbers of letters of ennoblement fluctuated between different reigns. Contamine, 1997, 67 to 68. According to this indicator, the movement of commoners into the ranks of the nobility greatly accelerated in the early 14th century and peaked during its second half, figure 4.6. During the rest of the 15th century, however, the rate of ennoblement declined to much lower levels, suggesting a greatly decreased upward social mobility. Because downward mobility continued unabated during this period, the net result was a substantial decline in elite numbers. In the previous sections, we have cited numerous data suggesting that the rate of extinction of noble families went up in the 14th and 15th C, HAPTER 440. Figure 4.6, upward social mobility in France, 1300 to 1500. Royal letters of ennoblement, Contamine 1997. Centuries compared to that of the preceding period. When upward mobility was also choked off, figure 4.6, it stopped compensating for the losses of old families, and the old nobility shrank in number. However, a conclusion that the old elites were replaced wholesale by new, recently ennobled elites would be too hasty. Many of the newly ennobled lineages did not manage to establish themselves and went extinct. Of the old lineages, some lost ground and disappeared, but others persisted and even managed to increase their lands. This process can be illustrated with the situation in the Sologne, in the county of Blois. The Sologne contained 9 fiefs possessing the right of high justice. 5 of these fiefs remained within the hands of the old nobility without interruption. Of the remaining 4, one was seized by the Duke of Orleans for its debts, one was sold to another old noble family, and the last 2 were acquired by new nobility, the D. Tamps family, originating in the late 14th century. Thus, the total number of old noble families shrank appreciably, but there was only one parvenu family to plug the resulting gap. Guerin, 1960. A study by Maurice Berthe, 1976, indicated similarly that in the county of Bigorre there were 40 fiefs in 1313 but only 18 in 1429. 12 fiefs disappeared, together with the villages on which their existence depended, while 10 had been acquired by 6 of the surviving 18 seigneurs, cited in Major 1981. 3. Another example comes from the study of Edouard Baratier, Medievalfrance 141, 1971. In 1377, 5 villages in Provence were inhabited by 38 nobles, of whom 17 were not living as nobles, probably because they could not afford it. By 1427 to 31, the number of nobles had declined to 22. In 1458, there were only 6 nobles left, but after that the number increased, and there were 12 nobles in 1474, Major 1993, 70. As the number of elite families was pruned, those that remained were strengthened. 4.6 Conclusion: a near-perfect multi-secular cycle. The quotation in the heading is, of course, from Braudel, 1988:131. Our starting date for the cycle differs from that of Braudel. There are reasons to believe that the period 950 to 1150 was a separate secular cycle in Western Europe. But if we focus on France between 1150 and 1450, then indeed the data paint a nearly perfect example of a secular cycle. All the major variables behaved during this period as postulated by the demographic structural theory. Population, prices, and other economic variables for which we have data went through a high amplitude oscillation. For example, the difference between population minima and the maximum was twofold, and in some regions, such as Normandy and Ile-de-France, the difference was 3- and even 4-fold. Social structure also oscillated in a manner predicted by the theory all. Though the estimates of Contamine, 1997, namely that nobility accounted 1.8% of the total population around 1300, decreasing thereafter to 1.5% in the 15th century, are overly conservative. The average of the 11 regions for which he found data on noble commoner proportions is 2.4%. Furthermore, after the famines and epidemics of the first half of the 14th century, the ratio of nobles to commoners should have increased even further, driven by variation in the mortality rate among classes. In other words, the decline in the elite commoner ratio between 1350 and 1450 was probably more extreme than what is suggested by Contamine's estimates. The extreme nature of elite overproduction in 14th century France is graphically illustrated by tens of thousands of surplus nobility seeking military employment, but finding death or capture on the fields of Crécy, Poitiers, and others. The strength of the state followed a grand cycle, from geopolitical successes during the 12th and 13th centuries to persistent fiscal trough, bless and territorial losses of the 100 Years' War, which were reversed only after 1450. The fall and then rise of political instability is graphically illustrated by the time distribution of coin hoards. The main reasons for an excellent match between theoretical predictions and empirical patterns are probably 2. The first is the slow advance of Chapter 4.142. Technology, especially agricultural technology, during the period. Thus, it appears that the carrying capacity of France hardly changed between 1150 and 1450, in contrast to the following early modern period. Second, during most of the period, France was the hegemonic power in Western Europe. Tuchman, 1978, Sumption, 1991. Its dynamics were therefore primarily determined by endogenous rather than exogenous forces. The only major exception to this was the arrival of the Black Death from the steppes of Eurasia in 1348. But the plague epidemic arrived after the population had already started to decline, and thus it accelerated and deepened the ongoing decline rather than shifting the endogenously driven trajectory to an entirely different attractor. Chapter 5. Early Modern France, the Valois Cycle, 1450 to 1660. 5.1 Overview. During the early modern period, France went through 2 secular waves, the Valois and the Bourbon cycles. We use the convention of naming the cycle after the dynasty that ruled during its integrative phase. In this chapter, we dissect the demographic, economic, and social trends of the Valois cycle, We do not address the Bourbon cycle in this book because its dynamics, especially during the later phases, were greatly modified by the industrial revolution. The end of the Hundred Years' War marked the beginning of a secular integrative trend in France. The expansion phase lasted until roughly 1520, and the stagflation phase from 1520 to 1570. The crisis of the wars of religion was followed by depression and another crisis of the Fronde. As a result, the disintegrative tendency prevailed during the period of 1570 to 1660. The cycle ended when Louis XIV, the Sun King, assumed personal control of the government, marking the beginning of the expansionary phase of the next secular cycle. Population and economy. For reference, the population trend is depicted in Figure 4.1a. As usual, the integrative phase was a period of sustained population growth. During the disintegrative phase, population declines were interspersed with short-term periods of growth. These dynamics are discussed in more detail in section 5.6. Prices, see Figure 4.1b and the discussion in the previous chapter, also behaved in a way generally consistent with the phases of the cycle. The Great Price Inflation, the price revolution of the 16th century, was followed by deflation during the 17th. Real wages were the mirror image of prices, Figure 5.1. During the 16th century, real wages literally collapsed to 1/5 of their level in the golden age of the later 15th century. The 17th century saw some increase, with important fluctuations to be discussed later, but the working classes never regained their economic ground. Even at the peak of the later 17th century, real wages were less than half what they were 2 centuries earlier. CHAPTER 5144. Figure 5.1 real wage in France, 1450 to 1700, in kilograms of grain per day. The real wage is calculated by taking an average of the wages paid to labourers and craftsmen in Paris, as reported by Allen, 2001, and deflating them by the price of wheat, Abel, 1980. Social structure. The social structure of France around 1500 was not dramatically different from that of the medieval period. The rural population lived in 30,000 villages, parishes. At the top of the rural hierarchy was the seigneur, usu ally but not always a nobleman. Connect 2001, 8. According to the estimate of Contamine, 1997:56, the proportion of nobles among the general population was 1.5%. There were about 200,000 persons in 40,000 noble families. Thus, many parishes had more than one noble family. The noble density was particularly high in Bretagne, where some parishes had more than 10 nobles, Contamine 1997:54. Below the seigneur in the social hierarchy came farmers, fermiers. These were substantial peasants with 30 hectares of land or more, Connect 2001, 9. Their abundant land, which they cultivated using their own and hired labour, permitted them to lead comfortable if not ostentatious lives, Leroy Ladurie, 1987, 181, and left a surplus that could be used to buy more land or to set up as grain merchants or cattle breeders. Farmers, often EARLYMODERNFRANCE 145, acted as intermediaries between the seigneur and the rest of the peasants, Connect 2001, 9. The first estate in the village was represented by the parish priest. The numbers of the secular clergy were in the region of 100,000, including 30,000 parish priests. There were about 100 bishops and several hundred abbots, Connect 2001, 9. The urban society had its own hierarchy. The elites were divided between wealthy merchants and office holders. Below them were artisans, smaller merchants, journeymen, and large numbers of manual workers. The state. Time series data on royal revenues during the 16th and 17th centuries are hard to come by, and the numbers given by various authorities often contradict each other. Figure 5.2 shows 3 views of royal taxation during the Valois cycle. 1. Total taxes, calculated by Brodel and Labrousse, 1977:979, for a set of years from 1453 to 1683, original data from Chonu. 2. A recent compilation of the total revenues between 1515 and 1788, 18th century numbers are not shown, by Kaiser and Linton, 2001. And 3. The Taille, land tax, given in Bonny, 1999. The latter 2 datasets are annual and were converted to decadal averages for presentian purposes. All data sets are expressed in the same units, millions of hectoliters of wheat. Although they disagree in detail, the overall picture is rather consistent. These data suggest that real revenues grew during the second half of the 15th century, owing to an increasing taxpayer base resulting from population growth and territorial conquest. During the 16th century, state revenues stagnated and then declined in real terms, reaching their lowest point during the Wars of Religion. After the change of dynasty, the Bourbons were able to restore royal finances, apart from the fiscal collapse during the Fronde, and then, under Louis XIV, exceed the levels achieved by the Renaissance monarchs. Because we do not currently have a good summary of French coin hoards for the period after 1385, we use the instability index developed by Sorokin, 1937. In figure 5.3, we plot the index for the period of 1150 to 1700, giving us a synoptic view of both the medieval and early modern cycles. The first two periods of internal warfare, around 1200 and 1400 respectively, match well the peaks of coin hoard deposition. Compare with figure 4.2. This increases our confidence that the two measures of socio-political instability reflect real historical processes. The third period of internal warfare is characterized by a double peak corresponding to the Wars of Religion and the Fronde. Territorial expansion generally occurred during the periods of internal stability and national consolidation. See figure 4.1c. The century CHAPTER 5146. Figure 5.2, Royal Revenues in France, 1450 to 1700. Data from Brodel and Labrousse, 1979-79, Kaiser and Linton, 2001, and Bonney, 1999. Figure 5.3, Sorokin's Instability Index for France, 1150 to 1700. EARLYMODERNFRANCE 147. After 1450 resulted in an almost doubling of the French territory, followed by stagnation and even reverses until the beginning of the next cycle, when France enjoyed another period of territorial expansion under Louis XIV. We now turn to a more detailed discussion of phases in the Valois cycle. 5.2 Expansion, 1450 to 1520. General population. The period between 1450 and 1520 was very favourable for demographic expansion. The first and foremost factor was the expulsion of the English from France and the end of the 100 Years' War, usually dated to 1453. Another important threat to internal stability was removed when the Burgundian state collapsed in 1477 as a result of the defeat and death of Charles the Bold at the hands of the Swiss at Nancy. Epidemics continued to strike the population, but at a comparatively lower rate than during the 14th or 17th centuries. Agricultural production increased, owing simply to the reclamation of previously abandoned land, and before 1520, famine was a rare event. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 11-12. A trend in the overall volume of agricultural production can be traced by examining the receipts of tithes, Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 45-46. The lowest point of agricultural production in the Paris Basin was achieved around 1440. Between 1450 and 1500, cereal products tie-in nearly doubled. In the south, the lowest point was earlier, between 1400 and 1430, and the overall supply of cereals doubled, or more than doubled by the end of the 15th century. It is likely, then, that food production in 1500 was double the minimum of the early 15th century. Population growth during this period was much more modest. It is difficult to give a quantitative estimate, but the increase was no more than 50%. In other words, the supply of food per capita, and by implication the standard of living, grew very substantially. Another indicator of the high standard of living during the 15th century is provided by the real wages. The daily wage of a Parisian labourer could buy 16 kilograms of grain in the 1490s, compared to less than 4 kilograms 1 century later. Poitevin reapers had to work 5 days to earn the equivalent of 1 hectoliter of wheat in 1467-72. In 1578, they had to work 14 days to earn the same. Generally speaking, during the 16th century, wages lost more than 2/3 of their buying capacity, figure 5.3, and the high real wages of the 15th century were not to be matched until the late 19th century, as a result of relative prosperity among the common people. Toward the end of the 15th century, the general mortality rate fell to a compara, tithely low level, and the obsession with death so prevalent earlier in the CHAPT ER5 148. Century, with its dances, macabre, and recumbent effigies of naked corpses, ceased to occupy cultural heights. The vigor of the demographic expansion was manifested in repopulation of the countryside and immigration after Reconquest. For example, many villages in the Gironde that had been abandoned during the English wars were resettled with new colonists from the Occitan and French-speaking zones, starting with the reign of Louis XI, Le Roi Ladurie, 1987-11.
The elites.
The noble fortunes began their recovery during this period, Carpentier and Le Maine, 1996, figure 29. The dynamics of the revenues of one noble family, the Seigneurie du Plessis-Gramoire in Anjou, show that the worst period was the 1420s. The rising tendency becomes evident after 1460, and by 1500 the levels of 1300 are matched in nominal terms. The restoration of noble incomes by 1500 appears to be a general pattern. For example, the Seigneurie de Crayon increased from less than 1,000 livres in 1396 to 1,700 livres toward 1500. The income of the lordship of Saint-Fargeau was about 100 livres in mid-century. By 1484 it had increased to 5 cents livres, Carpentier and Le Maine, 1996, 468. A similar dynamic is demonstrated by several seigneuries in Normandy, Bois, 1984, 257, De Wald, 1987, and by the House of La Trémoille, Weary, 1977, D 1007. The state. The reconciliation of the Dauphiniste and Burgundian factions in 1435 ended the civil war, except for two aftershocks. The first one was the Praguerie in 1440, a revolt by the great nobles against the king, Charles VII, with support from the Dauphin, the future Louis XI. The second was the League of the Public Weal in 1465, a conspiracy against Louis XI by the Dukes of Alenc, Angers, Burgundy, Berry, Bourbon, and Lorraine, again supported by the Dauphin, future Charles VIII. After this last aftershock, France was not to see an elite rebellion for a century. The core regions of France were spared any serious fighting from 1453 to the start of the Wars of Religion in 1562, Knecht, 2001-3. The increasing internal strength of France, both economic and socio-political, was rapidly translated by the ruling elites into territorial expansion. The state territory grew, first by a reconquest of the English-occupied lands, then by the reversal to the crown of the Appanages, earlier granted to Valois princes. In 1477, Charles the Bold of Burgundy died in the Battle of Nancy without male issue. Louis XI united the Duchy of Burgundy with the crown and occupied the county of Burgundy, Franche-Comté. On the extinction of the House of Anjou in 1480, Anjou, Bar, Maine, and ARLYMODERNFRANCE 49. Provence reverted to the French crown. Other smaller incidents of territorial expansion were the acquisition of Cerdagne and Roussillon, 1462, and the redemption of the Somme towns, 1463. The last great duchy of medieval France that was still independent of the crown, Brittany, was attached to France when Charles VIII married Anne of Brittany in 1491. In 1495, Charles VIII began a series of Italian campaigns that eventually mutated into the great Habsburg-Valois struggle for European hegemony in the 16th century. The territorial expansion of France during the 15th century was striking. From a low point in 1430 of 290,000 square kilometers, the territory controlled by the French kings reached 500,000 square kilometers in 1510. Increased territory and a growing population expanded the tax base of the kingdom. Between 1453 and 1515, state revenues tripled from 1.8 to 5.5 million livres tournois, LT. Braudel and Labrousse, 1977, 979, 5.3 stagflation, 1520 to 70. Population and economy. By 1560, the population of France had doubled from its late medieval low, Dupaquier et al., 1988b, reaching 20 million, or roughly the same level as around 1300. In the late 16th century, however, population dynamics entered a different regime, one of short periods of growth interspersed with declines, leading overall to the stagnation of population numbers. The reason for the cessation of population growth is clear. population growth outpaced the ability of early modern agriculture to feed it. As we noted in the previous section, cereal production, as indexed by tithes, expanded rapidly in the post-1450 period. Between 1450 and 1505, production gains substantially outpaced population increases. After a brief transitional period, 1505 to 20, the production of cereals continued to rise until 1560, but at a slower pace, as the limit to the amount of available land was approached. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 121. Now it was population that outpaced production, and by 1560 the population was approaching the upper ceiling that could be supported in France, given the 16th century level of technology. This number makes sense, at least to the order of magnitude, in light of what we know about the productive capacity of medieval and early modern French agriculture. At the rate of 210 to 240 kilograms of cereals per year per inhabitant, this figure takes into account children who eat less than adults, and adding the quantities of grain necessary for sowing and for animal consumption, the 20 million inhabitants of France between 1550 and 1720 must have consumed 60 million quintals of cereals. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 231. Since the annual cereal crop was produced on about 10 CHAPTER 5150. Million $HA, Leroy-Ladurie 1987:240. The average yield implied by these numbers is 600 kilograms per hectare, or 8 hectoliters per hectare. The latter number is comfortably in the middle between average yields prevailing in the south, 5 hectoliters per hectare, and those in the north, 10 hectoliters per hectare, taking into account the rotation systems prevailing in each region. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987-176. The chronology of cereal production dynamics, with the ceiling apples approached around 1560 and not exceeded until after 1700, is particularly relevant to the north of France. Elsewhere, there were important regional variations. Thus, the south apparently reached a production peak during the 1540s. This maximum level was not to be bettered until a century later, between 1649 and 1678. In Alsace, by contrast, the best period was reached between 1600 and 1630, before the collapse of the 30 Years' War. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 120. These regional variations are discussed below, in the context of when population declines occurred in different parts of France. Population growth had a direct effect on peasant-to-land ratios. In the depopulated 15th century, middle-sized landowners who owned about 10 hectares accounted for about half of those listed in the cadastral surveys. Most of these fair-sized holdings had disappeared by 1550, some as a result of accelerating subdivision within families, others bought by nobles and urban bourgeois. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987-56. In the Paris region, land fragmentation achieved an incredible degree, with only 1.3 hectares per tenant, Jacquard cited in Leroy-Ladurie 1987:162. Population growth also caused a general rise in ground rents, although there were important geographic variations in the timing of rent increases. To start with, the ground rents were very low in the 15th century. In the village of Vierzey, Soissonnais, the rent was only 0.5 hectoliters of grain per hectare in 1448. By 1511 it had risen to 2 hectoliters per hectare, Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 177. Between 1500 and 1560 rents stayed steady at about 1.5 hectoliters per hectare in the south of France and 2.5 hectoliters per hectare in the Paris region and Soissonnais. During the wars of religion, rents slightly declined, but in the 17th century they again started to increase. About 1650 to 70 they rose to 3 hectoliters per hectare in Languedoc and to 5 hectoliters per hectare in the Paris region, which amounted to almost one-half the product, taking into account disparities in yields and rotation systems. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 177. In other regions, such as the Hurepoix and Poitou, rent increases had already occurred by 1560. For example, the métayers in Poitou had to pay half their produce to the landlord in the 16th century, compared to a fourth to a third in the 15th century. These conditions of harsh métayage were relaxed only after 1650. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 177 to 78.
Land prices increased. In the 1550s, a hectare of ploughland around Paris cost 63 livres. 2 decades later, land prices had increased to 150 livres per hectare. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 239 to 40. EARLYMODERNFRANC, E151.
The trend in real wages was typical of the stagflation phase. The average real wage of Parisian builders fell from 25 plus or minus 2 kilograms of wheat per day, typical of peaceful periods of the 15th century, to 7 to 8 kilograms per day during the second half of the 16th century, and then to less than 5 kilograms per day during the disastrous decade of 1590 to 99. Figure 5.1. Agricultural wages also declined calamitously. The real wage of vineyard workers lost 2/3 to 3/4 of its value between 1495 and 1560. On the other hand, some categories of workers, such as hay reapers, did somewhat better, losing only 30% in real terms during the same period. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 185 to 186. The fall in real wages affected not only the working poor. Whereas in 1480 the manager of a large farm near Narbonne received a salary equivalent to 31 hectolitres of wheat, his successor's salary in 1590 was only 17.2 hectolitres. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 69. One stratum that did relatively well, or at least did not lose ground, during the stagflation phase was the farmers, who benefited from their situation as intermediaries between the lords and peasants. The economic conjuncture of rising grain prices, stagnating rents, whether decimal or fiscal, and rapidly falling wages worked to their advantage. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 181 to 84. As a result, during the 16th century, but unlike in the 17th century, farmers were able to hold their own and could even aspire to advance up the social hierarchy. Elites. While the stagflation phase saw a progressive worsening of the economic situation of common people, for the elites the economic conjuncture was good, resulting in two related developments. First, growing inequality among commoners meant that although the majority of them were sinking into misery, a small minority did very well and acquired substantial wealth. These well-to-do commoners, the farmers discussed in the previous paragraph, and merchants naturally aspired to translate their wealth into status. Many such elite aspirants succeeded, generating a steady inflow into the ranks of nobility. Second, given favorable economic conditions, many noble families provided substantial inheritances to their younger sons. This practice led to estate subdivision and the multiplication of nobles. For example, one of the richest French magnates, François de la Trémoille, 1502 to 42, had to provide for 5 sons and dowries for 2 daughters. This division of the estate and the subsequent wars of religion led to a drop in family revenues from 600 kilograms of silver in the 1530s to 430 kilograms in 1619, Weary 1977, Major 1981. Another example is the Roncherolles family in Normandy, which divided its estates in 1570 among 4 sons. The barony of Pont-Saint-Pierre went to the eldest son, but the other 3 also got what amounted to 552. Substantial lordships, Dewald, 1987:163. These 2 examples, of course, are no more than anecdotal evidence, but data on the noble families of the Bayeux region during 1463 to 1666 provide a firmer quantitative support. Wood, 1980. During most of this period, the numbers of ancient nobility, families who were ennobled prior to 1463, shrank, except during one time interval 1540 to 98. See Table 5.2 and the discussion in Section 5.5. Driven by upward mobility and estate subdivision, the numbers of nobles increased dramatically during the 16th century. The numbers of chevaliers, knights, for example, doubled during the 16th century from 1,000 to more than 2,000. Orleans, 1980-59. But the top elite stratum, pairs laquais, or lay peers, expanded even faster, from only 12 in 1505 to 36 in 1588, Labatut, 1972. An inevitable result of this increase was intensifying intralite competition for status and wealth. One way we can gauge the increasing social pressure on the elites is by the incidence of in-traylight violence, which during this period took the form of duelling. See also Chapter 3. Duelling had almost disappeared in France during the 15th century and early 16th century. Harding, 1978-77. Under Francois I and Henri II, a handful of judicial duels took place with royal sanction. After 1560, however, duelling for personal honour and without royal sanction became so common that Lanoux believed more noblemen died from it than in combat. Estoile believed 7,000 to 8,000 were killed in the 2 decades after 1588, Harding 1978-77, 253. It was said that Henri IV granted more than 6,000 pardons for the killing of gentlemen in duels during the first 10 years of the 17th century, Stone 1965, 246. Dueling was effectively eliminated only a century later, during the rule of Louis XIV, Collins 1995, 85. Another sign of the ripening demographic structural crisis was the increased competition for patronage among elite networks. The struggle between the Montmorency and Guise factions for control of court patronage is famous. After the death of Henri II, during the short reign of Francois II, the Guise faction managed to practically monopolize the royal patronage in their hands. Harding 1978:35. The death of Francois II and the alienation of the Guises from the court allowed Catherine de' Medici to regain control of the royal patronage, but at the expense of alienating a large segment of the French elites and the state. At the same time that the expanding elite numbers were putting increasing pressure on the state finances, the state's ability to collect revenue, in real terms, was declining. Figure 5.2. The fiscal crisis of the state was a major precondition of the crisis of the wars of religion. In 1559, Henri II signed the Peace of Cateau Cambrésis with the Spanish. The cessation of the Habsburg-Valois wars meant that hundreds of noble sons were thrown I ali modiaren Francais 153. Back on the home estates, where the family resources were often insufficient to support them, Bitten 1969. Moreover, the financial situation of the crown made it impossible to continue the patronage system on the old footing, Briggs 1998-15. The Cardinal of Lorraine, beset by would-be clients, was reduced to threatening to hang the next man who asked for a pension, Briggs 1998-15. The contraction of the largesse of the state affected even the top magnates of the kingdom, the provincial governors, Harding 1978:47. The governors from southern and western provinces reported that they could not rely on the loyalty of their subordinates who were attracted to the new religion. As the era of the secret conventicles came to an end, service as protectors for the Calvinist communities represented an available option to royal service for noblemen, and the pastors apparently resorted to straightforward bribery. Harding 1978-49. The Guises' monopoly of patronage bred much resentment on the part of those they excluded. Briggs 1998:15. The tumult of Amboise, 1560, was a conspiracy by some Protestant nobles against the Guises. Most of the conspirators were petty seigneurs of ancient lineage. Salmon 1976:124. As the financial crisis deepened, the wages of troops fell into arrears, and eventually the state lost control of the army. Contemporary letters, cited by Harding 1978:49-50, provide a wonderful illustration of this demographic structural mechanism of state collapse. Goldstone 1991. One officer reported in 1561 that his unpaid troops in Brittany have left to pillage. In the end, I expect to be all alone. There is so much due to the men of my company, that I am neither feared nor obeyed. A year later, another officer described how his troops, who had not been paid in a year, ate the horses in the garrison and then retired to their houses without a sou. The same year, a third captain, lacking money to pay them, disbanded his Provence Al levies, who dispersed in gangs that attacked Calvinists all over the province, holding some for ransom and killing others. With the onset of civil war in 1562, the royal finances completely collapsed. Desperate measures such as pawning royal jewels, Bonny 1999, and selling church property, which brought more than 13 million livres, Le Roi La Durie 1994, 240, were completely insufficient to keep up with military expenditures. The
result was a spiraling state debt, which reached 296 million livres by 1595, Bonny 1999. The debt was almost wiped out during the reign of Henri IV, but ballooned again during the crisis of the Fronde, reaching 700 million livres in 1661, Briggs 1998.
5.4 Crisis, 1570 to 1600. By the end of the stagflation phase, the population of France had recovered to roughly the level that obtained before the 14th century collapse. In the late 16th century and all of the 17th century, population CHAPTER 5,154. Growth ceased. The overall population of France, adding together rural and urban locations and northern and southern provinces, stagnated, so that the French population of 1720 was essentially the same as that of 1560, Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 232. This does not mean that population numbers were in equilibrium. There were several temporal fluctuations, and different regions of the kingdom followed different trajectories. Here we focus on the temporal fluctuations, while deferring a discussion of regional variations to the next section. Leroy-Ladurie distinguishes three classes of temporal fluctuations. 1. Those occurring on the timescale of centuries, which we call secular cycles. 2. Those occurring on the timescale of decades, which we call bigenerational cycles. And 3. Those occurring on an annual timescale. During the period of 1560 to 1720, there were three fluctuations of the second type. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 233. 1. A population decline during the Wars of Religion, followed by some recovery during the reign of Henri IV and the early years of Louis XV. 2. A decline during the 30 Years' War and the Fronde, followed by a recovery under Fouquet and Colbert. And 3. The troubles of the second half of the reign of Louis XIV, followed by a sustained population takeoff under his two successors that finally broke through the medieval ceiling of 20 million. See Figure 4.1a. The proximate mechanisms of population declines were the three scourges of plague, famine, and war. Measured by the number of communities hit by the plague, Biraben 1975, the incidence of epidemics increased from the minimum of 1,400 throughout the 15th and 16th century. Rise, Figure 5.4. The plague reached pandemic levels first during the height of the Wars of Religion in the 1580s, and then again at the peak of the 30 Years' War, the 1620s and 1630. In 1583, the plague may have killed 1/3 of the inhabitants of the city of Angers, Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 270. Elsewhere in the Anjou, many parishes lost 1/4 to 1/3 of their dwellers. In the 17th century, the Anjou was hit repeat, Edley by comparable outbreaks in 1626 to 27, 1631 to 32, and 1639. The plague was carried by the movements of troops and spread throughout the kingdom, affecting in alternating waves the Massif Central, the Aquitaine Basin, the Armorican Massif, and the Paris Basin, Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 270. Famine was widespread during this period, from the food shortages arising from the activities of the anti-Huguenot Catholic League in the 1590s through the subsistence crises of 1630, 1649, 1652, 1661, and 1694, to the Great Grainless Winter of 1709, Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 272. The immediate triggers of these crises were periods of very cold or very damp winters and unusually wet summers. For example, the famines of 1630 and 1661 occurred during peacetime and were entirely due to bad weather. However, such crises caused very short-term declines, what Leroy-Ladurie has called third-order fluctuations. These fluctuations temporarily disturbed with EAR, Li, Mo, D, RN, FR, and CE 155. Figure 5.4 Incidence of Plague in France, 1450 to 1700. Data from Biraben, 1975. Out really altering them in a lasting way, the levels and ratios of population and food supplies. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 276. During the famines of the 1590s and 1649 to 52, which had a much more lasting effect on population, the weather played a secondary role. It was civil war, rather than the rain, that killed the grain. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 273. We should qualify this argument by noting that it applies most cogently to the first two population declines, occurring prior the 1660s. The third decline, in the 2 decades around 1700, occurred when the state was strong, although it coincided with a series of particularly intense external wars. In our opinion, therefore, it was not brought about by demographic structural mechanisms. Historians have proposed various explanations for it, of which two appear most probable: a significant worsening of the climate and the great demands placed on the French peasantry by the aggressive external policy of Louis XIV. In any case, the issue of the third population decline falls outside the temporal framework of this chapter, and in the following we focus on the population dynamics up until 1660. Although the proximate factors of population declines during this period, 1570 to 1660, included epidemics and famine, it was often troop movements that spread epidemics, and the harvests were threatened or damaged by military operations and looting soldiers. Thus, the fundamental mechanism of population fluctuations was socio-political instability leading to civil war within the kingdom and the weakening of the state, which made it susceptible to foreign invasions. CHAP-TER 5156. The period of heightened political instability in France lasted about a century, from 1562 to 1675, Table 5.1. There were two waves, the first marked by the wars of religion and culminating around 1590, the second a period of magnate rebellions, Huguenot insurrections, and peasant uprisings that culminated in the Fronde of 1648 to 53. The double peak in figure 5.3 reflects these two waves. The two peaks of internal warfare were separated by a relatively stable 2 decades under Henry IV and the early years of Louis XIII. The wars of religion may have resulted in a population loss of 20% or more, Benedict 1985-96. In Orléans, the population was reduced by 1/3 between 1561 and 1597, Dupaquier et al. 1987 The population of Rouen was reduced by more than a quarter between 1562 and 1594, Benedict 1975-32. During the second period of sociopolitical instability, demographic losses in some regions were even greater. Thus, as a result of the combined effect of the 30 Years' War and the Fronde, certain provinces in the north and east probably lost close to half their inhabitants, Dupaquier et al. 1987.1552. The south of France was much less affected. This is discussed in section 5.6. 5.5 A Case Study: The Norman Nobility. As a result of research by historians such as Guy Bois, James Wood, and Jonathan Dewald, we have excellent quantitative data on the nobility of one region of France, Normandy. The situation in Normandy is particularly interesting because this province appears to be reasonably representative of northern France. It is situated next to the core of the French state, but unlike Ile-de-France, its development was not heavily distorted by the influence of the capital with its royal court and the central administrative apparatus. Thus, what we learn about the Norman situation at the very least yields testable hypotheses about other French regions and France as a whole. Certainly, it appears that the insights of Guy Bois, developed from the Norman material, proved to be of general validity, especially for northern France, but also for the whole kingdom, as long as known variations in social structures between the north and the south are taken into account. The dynamics of elite numbers. The first issue is, what were the numerical dynamics of nobility? And in particular, how did the ratio of noble to commoner households evolve during the Valois cycle? Using a variety of data sources, Bois, 1984, 71 to 77, established that the peak of general population during the 16th century was achieved by 1560. In fact, the peak was essentially approached by 1540. EARLYMODERNFRANCE 157. Table 5.1, Revolutionary Situations in France, 1500 to 1900. 1548 Pitot insurrection in Guyenne, 1562 to 63, First War of Religion, 1567 to 68. Second War of Religion, 1568 to 69. Third War of Religion, 1572 to 73. Fourth War of Religion, 1574 to 76. Fifth War of Religion, 1577. Sixth War of Religion, 1578 to 79. Seventh War of Religion, 1579 to 88th War of Religion, 1585 to 98. Ninth War of Religion, 1594 to 95. Croquant rebellions in southwest 1614 to 15. Civil War in Brittany 1617. War of Mother and Son 1619 to 20. War of Mother and Son 1621 to 22. Huguenot Wars 1625. Huguenot Wars 1627 to 30. Huguenot Wars. English intervention 1629 to 30. Croquant uprising 1635 to 36. Croquant uprising 1637 to 41. Croquant uprising 1639. Norman rebellion 1643 to 44. Revolt of Southwest 1648 to 53. The Fronde 1655 to 57. Tardonizat rebellion Guyenne 1658. Sabotiers rebellion Sologne 1661 to 62. Benauge rebellion Guyenne 1662. Loustucru rebellion Boulonnais 1663. Audihos rebellion Gascony 1663 to 72. Angelaise guerrilla warfare Roussillon 1675. Papier Timbre Bonnets Rouges rebellions Brittany 1702 to 06. Camisards rebellions Cevennes Languedoc 1768 to 69. Corsican rebellion 1789 to 99. French revolutions and counter-revolutions 1815 100 days 1830 July Revolution 1848. French Revolution 1851. Louis Napoleon's coup d'etat 1870. State collapse Occupation Republican revolutions 1871. Multiple communes. Source Tilly 1993 151 CHAPTER 5158. After 1540, baptism numbers in various communities stagnated. More precisely, they oscillated with periods of about a generation. Earlier, we showed that the secular decline of the population in northern France took place between 1560 and 1660, with shorter-term fluctuations around this trend, followed by population growth, interrupted by another decline around 1700. By 1720, the population numbers had probably regained the level of 1560. The numerical dynamics of nobility exhibited a distinctly different pat turn from the one characterizing the general, commoner population. Based on a study of the periodic investigations of the nobility in the election of Bayeux in Lower Normandy, Wood, 1980, was able to reconstruct changes in their numbers during the period 1463 to 1666, tables 5.2 and 5.3. At first, the total number of noble households grew slowly. In the 80 years before 1540, the numbers of nobles expanded at a rate of less than 0.5% per year. During the same period, the general population of Normandy increased at an average rate of 1.1% per year, from 30 to 75 on the relative scale in Figure 2 of Bois 1984-76. As a result, the proper tie-in of nobles to the total population declined. In fact, we can put an absolute estimate to this quantity as follows. In 1713, the election of Bayeux contained 22,620 hearths. Wood, 1980-22. The peak of 1560 must have been very close to this value, and by 1540 the population was perhaps 10% less. Thus, by 1540 there were at least 20,000 households in this region, of which 309 were noble, implying the proportion of nobility at 1.5%. Between 1540 and 1600, while the general population stagnated and in fact declined during 1570 to 1600, the numbers of nobility exploded. The growth rate during 1540 to 98 was more than 1% per year. During the first two-thirds of the 17th century, the numbers of nobility stagnated,
even declining between 1598 and 1624, but since the general population probably reached its minimum around 1660. The proportion of noble households among the total was at that time over 3%, double its value in 1540. To sum up, between 1460 and 1540, the numbers of nobles increased, but more slowly than the numbers of commoners, so that noble to commoner ratio decreased to 1.5%. Between 1540 and 1600, the commoner population stagnated while the numbers of nobles exploded, and between 1600 and 1660 both commoner and noble numbers stagnated, with the noble to commoner ratio at around 3%. The nobility of the Bayeux region was primarily rural. 1/3 to 1/2 of them were sword nobles, and only between 3 and 6% served as officials or professionals. Wood 1980, 75, 86. To examine the dynamics of the robe nobility during the 16th century, we turn to Duhalt's 1980 study of the magistrates in the Parlement of Rouen. The numbers EARLYMO DERNFRANCE 159.
Table 5.2 Numbers of Nobility of the Election of Bayeux as revealed by the researchers or periodic inspections of noble credentials by Crown officials. Noble families, year total old new and noblesse condemned, percent. 146321121-6.215232731779641-154 030917252152151-1.4154030917252 151-1.4154030917252 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 52151-1.41540309172 52151-1.41540309172 52151-1.41540309172 52151-1.41540309172 52151-1.41540309172 521-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 151-1.41540309172 52 151-1.41540309172 52
151-1.4, 154-0309-172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309-17, 252, 151-1.4, 154-0309-172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309-172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309-172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309, 172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309, 172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309, 172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309, 172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309, 172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309, 172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309, 172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309, 172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309, 172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309, 172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309, 172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309, 172, 52, 151-1.4, 154-0309, 172, 516-245-202, 114, 153.2, 16659.2, 1831092, 86.0.
Note: total denotes the total number of noble households. Old denotes the number of noble families that were ennobled prior to 1463. New denotes the number of noble families appearing in the election during the previous period. Annobles denotes the number of new noble families that were ennobled during the previous period. Condemned denotes those family heads permanently condemned, refused noble status by the Recherche Commissions. Table 5.3, rates of change in numbers of nobility of the election of Bayeux. Rate of change, arrival rate percent per year number of families per year. Period. All old new annobles. 1463-15230.43-0.29, 1.60.70, 1523 to 1540.73, minus 0.363.1, 0.9 1540 to 1598, 1.02, 0.363.1, 1.3 1598 to 1624, minus 0.28, minus 0.59, 1.60.2, 1624-16660.31 0.182.60.7. Note: rate of change is the proportional change, percent per year, in the number of noble families established at the beginning of the period and the end of the period. A negative sign indicates a decrease. Old denotes families whose nobility dated before the previous recherche. Arrival rate denotes the proportional increase, number of families per year, in the noble IT as a result of the appearance of new families, both noble immigrants and recent annobles. Annobles denotes families known to have been ennobled during the period preceding the recherche. Of high officials in Rouen experienced a tremendous growth during the 16th century. Table 5.4. Such a drastic expansion in the number of officials was not peculiar to Normandy. At the other end of France, in Montpellier, the number of office holders almost quadrupled, from 112 in 1500 to 442 in 1600. Greengrass, 1985, 122. It was estimated that in the whole of France, royal officials numbered slightly over 4,000 in 1515. Salmon, 1976-79. This number doubled during the next 50 years, then tripled again. By 1610, CHAPTER 5160. Table 5.4. The growth of the number of high officials in Rouen. Cour Chambre Bureau, Time Période des Aides Parlement des Comptes des Finances Totales. 15th century 8. 8 1499 835. 43 1554 1566. 81 1615 8364 12 1740. Later 17th century. Irnuraவது. Source: Dewald, 1980, 69. Note: in the late 15th century, before the establishment of Parlement in 1499, there was only one sovereign court in Rouen, the Cour des Aides, which included 8 members. 200 years later, the late 17th century intendant Voisin de la Noiraie listed 200 members of Rouen 4 sovereign courts. The lion's share of this growth occurred prior to 1600. Just the membership of Parlement increased from 35 to 83 during the 16th century. There were 25,000 office holders in France. Le Roi Ladurie, 1994, 275. During the 17th century, the numbers of officials oscillated wildly, increasing to perhaps 50,000 by the 1660s. A survey ordered by Colbert counted 46,047 venal office holders. The administration of Colbert made a concerted effort to reduce this number, so that by 1670, Colbert was claiming to have suppressed 20,000 offices. Doyle, 1996-23. Toward the end of the century, the number of venal offices had again increased, as the government of Louis XIV used all expedients to raise money for a series of grueling foreign wars. Causes underlying the growth of elite numbers. To sum up, the numbers of nobility greatly expanded between 1450 and 1660, with the bulk of the increase occurring during the Second